Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
You ever picture a moment for so long that it becomes part of the air you breathe? That was me on the morning of my big day, the one I thought would finally prove to everyone, especially my family, that I wasn't just the dreamer, the one chasing ideas, while the rest of them lived practical lives. I had worked for years to get here, building a company from the ground up with nothing but stubbornness and too much caffeine. I imagined the smiles, the proud glances, the way Mom might cry in the front row, pretending to be embarrassed while secretly loving it. I even had seats reserved, little white cards with gold lettering spelling out Mom, Dad, Lena, and Tom. For seats that meant everything. But when the lights dimmed and the announcer called my name, those 4 chairs stayed perfectly, painfully empty. I scanned the room, just once, pretending it was for dramatic effect, but my chest tightened as I realized no one I loved had shown up. The audience clapped, strangers smiled, cameras flashed, but all I saw was that row of emptiness, like a scar across the room. My voice didn't shake, though I thought it would. I spoke through the presentation, smiled at the right places, even laughed at my own jokes, the performance of my life, really. I guess you get good at pretending when you grow up the kind of daughter who learns early that silence earns more approval than honesty. After it was over, everyone congratulated me, hugged me, told me how inspiring I was. But inspiration is a lonely thing when it echoes back from strangers. I walked to the parking lot in heels that hurt, carrying a bouquet I'd bought myself just in case. The streetlights flickered, the air smelled like rain, and that's when the weight of it hit, all those years of trying to be good enough for people who would never see me as anything more than the kid sister, the second choice, the one who always took care of everyone else. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the phone screen, waiting for even one text. Nothing. Not a single, proud of you. So I did something reckless. I opened my camera and pressed record. My face looked strange in the dim light, part fury, part heartbreak. I didn't plan what I was going to say, I just spoke. To those who didn't care enough to be here, don't bother calling after. My voice didn't crack, but there was something in it I'd never heard before. Finality, maybe. Or the quiet realization that a lifetime of waiting for approval had ended in a parking lot outside my own success. I uploaded it before I could change my mind. A 30-second clip, nothing fancy, just truth. I didn't expect it to reach anyone. Maybe I wanted them to see it, maybe not. It didn't matter. I turned off my phone, drove home, and tried to convince myself I felt empowered instead of hollow. When I walked through the door, the apartment felt too clean, too quiet. The award sat on the counter where I'd left it, gleaming under the kitchen light, a silent witness to the irony of accomplishment. I poured a glass of cheap wine and sat on the floor, still in my heels, scrolling through photos of the night. I stopped on one, me on stage, smiling, hand raised in gratitude, eyes searching the crowd for faces that never came. I almost laughed. The world had probably seen me as confident, composed, radiant. But all I remembered was counting those empty chairs over and over again, like a habit I couldn't break. It wasn't until midnight that I noticed the first buzz. Then another. And another. My phone lit up with notifications like a pulse returning after a long silence. At first, I thought it was the group chat from work, maybe some congratulations. But when I glanced at the screen, my heart stuttered. Hundreds of messages, thousands of likes, comments flooding in. You said what so many of us wanted to say. This hit hard. Family doesn't always show up, but you did. Then came the calls. Unknown numbers. Then known ones. Mom. Dad. Lena. Even Tom. One after another. The same people who hadn't shown up when it mattered now couldn't stop trying to reach me. The irony wasn't lost on me. The clip had gone viral. People were calling it raw, brave, honest. I didn't feel any of those things. I just felt tired. By 1 in the morning, I had over 20 missed calls and more messages than I could count. But I didn't answer. I didn't even listen to a single voicemail. I just placed the phone face down on the table, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of my city outside. Somewhere out there, people were talking about me, dissecting my pain, turning my disappointment into a symbol. And my family, they were panicking. The last thing I remember before drifting off to sleep was a single thought, heavy and bitter and sharp. They finally noticed me, but only when the rest of the world did too. I didn't know yet that this was only the beginning, that the silence I'd chosen would speak louder than anything I'd ever said. By the time the sun pushed through the slats of my blinds and drew those thin, accusing lines across the floor, my phone looked like a slot machine that had decided it finally liked me, because every few seconds it lit up with a new apology, a new explanation, a new version of the same soft lie that people offer when they want forgiveness without the tedious labor of having earned it, and I lay there reading every word like I was inspecting an old stain, trying to figure out if it had always been that color or if time had made it worse. Mom wrote that she had been on her way, but the traffic was unreal, which sounded almost reasonable until I remembered the venue sat 3 blocks from a subway stop she knew by heart. Dad sent a tidy note about being tied up at the office. Even though he never worked late on a weekend unless golf counted as corporate strategy, my sister Lena swore she had the wrong time, although she had texted me the day before asking what shoes to wear, and Tom, the brother who treats sincerity like a foreign language he refuses to learn, left a voicemail that managed to sound supportive and irritated at the same time, as if my not scheduling my milestone around his availability represented personal aggression. I lay there long enough to notice how my throat clenched every time the phone buzzed, because even when you think you have finally learned the lesson, your body has a way of remembering an older curriculum where love means you calibrate your expectations downward and smile through the wobble, and I realized if I did not take control of the story right then, I would slip back into performing the same role I have been auditioning for since childhood, the agreeable daughter who absorbs the shock and bakes a cake afterward to prove there are no hard feelings. I made coffee, opened the sliding drawer where I keep old receipts and broken pens and the loyalty cards of restaurants that closed before I ever redeemed a stamp, and pulled out the small stack of printed invitations I had mailed to them a month earlier with the date circled in black ink and a handwritten note that read, "Front row saved for you," which meant their excuses were not just inaccurate but deliberate erasures. And that recognition felt like a slow, cool breath after standing too close to a stove. The clip kept spinning through the algorithm like a bottle rocket that refused to burn out, which would have been amusing if it weren't so personal, and in between the strangers who said they understood and the strangers who said I was dramatic, a producer from a morning show slid into my inbox asking whether I would come on to talk about boundaries, accountability, and modern family dynamics, phrased like a menu of vegetables I was supposed to pretend tasted like dessert, and although I ignored him for the moment, the phrase burrowed into my mind because that was exactly what I needed to establish, not just in a glossy interview but in my actual life where they had learned that I was always available, always useful, always the one who could be counted on to bend without snapping. So I wrote a message that was not a message, a little manifesto that I copied into my notes app and read aloud to my living room until it sounded less like anger and more like policy, and then I recorded a calm, steady video. Not a cry for attention, but a memo to the future, in which I said that family is not a discount code you apply at checkout. Family is the people who show up with wrinkled shirts and bad parking stories and damp eyes. Family is the human version of proof of purchase. And going forward, I would match energy with energy, presence with presence, care with care, and absence with silence, and I posted it without tagging anyone because if the shoe pinches, you do not need me to point out the blister. Then I made 3 small changes that felt pettier than I wanted to admit and yet tasted like a clean glass of water after too much sweet tea. First, I canceled the little auto transfer that had been sliding out of my account every month to keep Lena's online boutique subscription tools from shutting down, which I had set up during a tearful call 2 years ago and never mentioned again because my support was supposed to be invisible. Second, I emailed Dad's bookkeeper to let her know that I would no longer be helping informally with quarterly reconciliations for the family business, a task I had inherited back when my availability was considered a family asset, and I copied Dad on it with a line that read, "This is me respecting your time by not pretending I still have any of it to give." Third, I removed all 4 of them from the Friends and Family discount tier for my company's product because I realized nothing communicates new rules quite like the moment an old free door does not open anymore, and with those clicks I felt a little of the ache move out of my body and into the world where it belonged. The pushback arrived with the predictability of a train that always runs late but arrives loud. Mom texted that she felt punished for one mistake, even though we both knew this was a necklace of many beads. Dad wrote, "Let's be adults," which is rich when the adult thing would have been showing up. Lena sent a photo of a pile of packages she could no longer ship because the app had locked her out, cushioning it with a "babe, I would have been there if I could," and Tom, determined to miss the point by a country mile, suggested we all meet at the house Sunday night so I could explain why you're being so dramatic online, as if my life were a board meeting where he chaired the committee on tone. I typed and deleted a dozen replies, then settled on the only one that did not make my stomach cramp. I sent them a calendar invite titled "Office Hours for People Who Didn't Care Enough to Be There," set for the following evening at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the venue they had skipped. Included a short note that read, "Attendance is not mandatory, but it will be noted," and added a small attachment, a photo of the 4 empty chairs with their place cards, which said everything I could say, without raising my voice. At 5 in the afternoon my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and when I let it go to voicemail the transcription appeared with a sentence that made me sit down on the edge of the bed. Because the caller introduced himself as the representative of a private equity group that had been watching my company's growth for the past year and wanted to talk expansion and acquisitions, which is the sort of phrase that changes the temperature of a room. And as the screen filled with fresh messages from my family blinking like emergency lights, I realized that if I accepted the meeting, certain pillars of our old dynamic might not survive the week, and I clicked reply later while the phone started to vibrate again. This time with Mom's name and the word urgent, as the coffee shop's confirmation pinged, and I wondered, with a mix of dread and satisfaction, who would actually show. The coffee shop smelled like burnt sugar and espresso, that kind of bittersweet aroma that fills the air when people pretend to make amends over lattes. I chose the corner table deliberately, the one near the window with enough distance from the counter that I could watch them arrive one by one, measure the hesitation in their steps, the silent choreography of guilt. I arrived early, partly because I didn't want them to see me walking in, partly because I needed a few quiet minutes to rehearse the calm I had promised myself to maintain. Outside, the afternoon traffic was crawling, the city moving forward as if nothing monumental was about to happen, and I took a long breath, aware that this conversation, however polite it might appear on the surface, would mark the final excavation of a wound that had been festering since childhood. Mom arrived first, always punctual when the situation required sympathy. She wore that soft, practiced expression people reserve for funerals and family photos, sat down without a word, and ordered chamomile tea, as though calm could be bought by the cup. Dad came next, carrying the faint scent of cologne and regret, nodding once before checking his watch, already signaling that his time was precious. Lena drifted in a few minutes later, hair done too perfectly for someone who claimed to have been rushing, and Tom, predictably, entered last, phone in hand, grin ready, the self-appointed peacemaker of disasters he usually caused. For a moment, looking at the 4 of them together, I felt the strange dissonance of belonging to people who only recognized the version of me that required their approval. "Let's just clear the air," Mom began, her voice smooth and deliberate, the kind of tone that fills silence without truly saying anything. "We didn't mean to hurt you. Things just got complicated." She glanced at Dad for reinforcement, but he was scrolling through his phone, pretending to look busy. Lena leaned back with a sigh, playing the part of the misunderstood sister. "Honestly, I thought your event was more of a networking thing, not a big formal ceremony," she said, her tone defensive, as if my success had somehow inconvenienced her schedule. I smiled faintly, not because I found any of it amusing, but because the predictability of their script was almost comforting in its transparency. "You all had invitations," I said, keeping my voice even. "Printed, mailed, confirmed. You knew exactly what it was." My father looked up then, his eyes narrowing slightly, the way they used to when I dared to challenge him at the dinner table. "Let's not make this bigger than it is," he said, his default strategy when the facts didn't favor him. "Family shouldn't need to prove support by attending every event." We've always been proud of you." The last sentence sounded like it had been rehearsed. I watched his mouth form the words and felt nothing. Pride without presence was as empty as the seats they had left unfilled. Lena crossed her arms. "You didn't have to post that video," she muttered, her voice sharp now, dropping the pretense of concern. "You made us look awful." I laughed softly, the sound more bitter than I intended. "You managed that yourselves," I said. "I just told the truth." Tom interjected then, always the mediator, leaning forward with a conciliatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Look, sis, we get it, you're hurt. But putting this online, come on, that was harsh. You could have called us. We would have explained." "Would you?" I asked, leaning back, watching their discomfort ripple through the table like heat. "Because for years, I've been explaining. Every time I succeeded, I had to downplay it so no one felt small. Every time I failed, I had to smile so no one felt burdened. I've been shrinking myself to fit into this family's version of acceptable, and last week, I finally stopped." For a few seconds, no one spoke. The hum of the coffee machine filled the space where empathy should have lived. Mom finally whispered, "We just didn't think it was that important." The words landed like a confession and a dismissal in one breath. I stared at her, realizing how many moments in my life had been dismissed in exactly the same way: graduations, promotions, birthdays, all filed under not that important because they didn't serve anyone else's narrative. "Funny," I said quietly, "because it turns out a few million strangers thought it was." Dad looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" I met his gaze. "It means the video you all hate so much reached the kind of people who actually show up. Investors, partners, people who understand what commitment looks like. One of them is buying into my company." I paused, letting the words sink in, then added, almost casually, "And he's also buying out a few local businesses. One of them happens to be yours, Dad." The silence that followed was total. Even the background music seemed to fade. My father's face drained of color, and for the first time, he didn't have a response ready. Mom blinked rapidly, processing, while Lena muttered something under her breath that I didn't bother deciphering. Tom was the first to recover, though his voice trembled slightly. "You wouldn't do that," he said, half question, half plea. I looked at him with a calmness that surprised even me. "I already did." I stood then, smoothing my jacket, feeling a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. They stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not the dependable daughter, not the backup plan, but the person who had quietly built something they could neither control nor diminish. "You all taught me something," I said, collecting my things. "When people don't show up for you, stop saving them a seat." Mom's voice trembled as I turned to leave. "We didn't mean for it to go this far." I glanced back once. Neither did I. Outside, the light had shifted, the afternoon turning amber, the air heavy with that stillness that comes before a storm. My phone buzzed with another notification, the deal confirmation. I smiled faintly, slid it into my pocket, and walked away without looking back, knowing that for the first time, the distance between us was not measured in miles, but in truth. The morning after the coffee shop summit felt like standing in a hallway between two houses, one that had already burned down and one that hadn't caught yet, but smelled unmistakably of smoke. Because while the investors' attorneys were moving with the ruthless speed of people who sharpen their teeth on contracts, my family was still repeating the same lines as if they could chant the past back into compliance. And I found myself answering emails about integration timelines, vendor obligations, and press language while my phone vibrated with a stream of messages that used words like love and pride and misunderstanding, as if the repetition alone could convert them into facts, which it could not. I sat at my small dining table with a legal pad I did not need, drawing lines down the page to separate what I could control from what I could not, and as the column of control filled with practical things, payroll continuity for the employees in Dad's shop, negotiated grace periods for longtime suppliers who had always extended credit out of trust, a scholarship carved from my marketing budget for 2 students from our town who kept their heads down and did the work while louder kids got the invitations. The other column revealed itself as the graveyard of old habits, and I wrote at the top of it the sentence that would become my quiet oath, that I would match presence with presence and that Not guilt or nostalgia or the illusion of owed gratitude would make me put people back on a pedestal that they had stepped off willingly. The deal memo arrived before noon, a neat stack of pages with red lines that looked like the aftermath of an argument translated into ink, and as I read through the clauses I had pushed for, protections for the rank-and-file workers who had shown up for decades without making themselves the heroes of every quarterly report, retention bonuses that actually looked like gratitude rather than confetti, a community grant earmarked for the public library that had been the only place I felt unconditionally welcome as a teenager. I felt a strange mixture of triumph and grief. Triumph, because this was the kind of leverage people fantasize about when they are told to be patient. Grief, because wielding it against people who share your face is a little like performing surgery on your own reflection. Before I could sign, the intercom buzzed with the anxious staccato that has always meant Mom, and when I opened the door she was there with an expression that tried to do 3 jobs at once: chastise, plead, and absolve. And with a plastic bakery box in her hands like a prop from a play about reconciliation, and I stepped aside because I am not cruel, even when I am done pretending otherwise, and she walked in with that careful grace that announces itself as fragility even though it is often just strategy. She talked for a long time, circling the same clearing, explaining in a soft voice that what happened on my big day was an accident made of smaller accidents, that families become messy when no one knows which role to play anymore, that she had never imagined I would take things this far, and I listened because listening costs less than arguing, and when she ran out of words she lifted the lid of the bakery box as if sugar could broker a truce and said that they were ready to attend anything I wanted to schedule, that we should do a May-up night, that it would mean so much to the neighbors to see us happy. I told her, as evenly as I could, that there would be no May-up night because the world is not a sitcom with laughter cues, and that I was not angry in the way she kept implying, hot, dramatic, performative, but final in the way a lock is final when you stop carrying the key, and that while I would never humiliate them for sport, I would also never again absorb the consequences of decisions they made with their eyes open. And the strangest thing happened then. Because instead of exploding or dissolving, she just stared at me with a dawning comprehension I had not seen on her face in years, a comprehension that suggested she finally believed I meant what I said about matching presence with presence. And she reached out to touch my sleeve and whispered that Dad had been under pressure, that he had been worried about liquidity, that he had done something which he told her was temporary and then never reversed. And the way she said temporary made my stomach turn because I knew exactly what it meant. I walked to the kitchen drawer where I keep old paperwork and pulled out the manila envelope that I had been too exhausted to open for months, the one with my name handwritten by a bank officer who still mails personal notes. And inside was the confirmation of something I had suspected but avoided, because suspicion is a soft fever and proof is a hard blade, and there it was in tidy numbers and polite language. The record of my old savings account stripped down in a series of withdrawals timed to the year Lena launched her boutique, followed by a transfer into the family business operating account that listed Dad's signature on the authorization line, and if I had needed a reason to stop negotiating with nostalgia, the paper offered it without flourish. I did not raise my voice, because fury would have made this easier for her to dismiss, and instead I showed the statement to Mom, watched the color drain from her face, listened to the delicate clatter of the cake knife against the cardboard as her hand shook. And then I told her what would happen next, that I would sign the deal as written with the employee protections intact, that the final draft would include an audit not as revenge, but as daylight, that I would decline any ceremonial role in the transition because I had no interest in becoming the mascot of my own boundary, and that any funds routed through my accounts in the past without consent would be reconciled legally, not through a family meeting with muffins. After she left, walking down the hall with that stiff dignity people borrow when they are trying not to hurry, I recorded one more message. Nothing viral and nothing theatrical, just a clear, almost boring statement posted to my company page. That we were expanding and that with growth came responsibility, that we were funding a library program for teens who work after school, that we were partnering with a job training nonprofit to place workers who wanted skill upgrades before the new machines came in, and I ended it with a line that sounded like policy and felt like truth, that we show up for those who show up, that this is our culture now. And then I signed the contracts and set the pen down with a steadiness that surprised me. The phone buzzed again, not with a familiar name, but with a blocked number that left a voicemail I almost deleted without listening, and the transcription appeared like a small gray storm cloud across the top of the screen. A man's voice saying he represented a concerned party who had information about sabotage surrounding your event, that the empty chairs had not been entirely accidental, that someone had quietly redirected reminders and posed as me to change the start time in a family thread I never saw, and as the words arranged themselves into a new kind of pattern, the room seemed to tilt just enough to make me reach for the table. Because suddenly the betrayal I had decided to treat as simple negligence began to look like a plan executed by someone who smiled at me while I ironed my dress, and the message ended with a time and a place to meet if I wanted details, leaving me staring at the muted phone and the signed contract and the neat stack of pastries no one had touched. While the truth, still unconfirmed and yet already too plausible, hovered in the doorway like an invitation I knew I would accept. The man who had left the voicemail turned out to be the operations manager from the venue who had watched my clip on his commute and recognized the pattern in the panic, because the morning of my event he had fielded a series of courteous calls from someone claiming to speak on behalf of the family, a woman who asked to adjust the start time for internal arrivals, and to reroute reminders to a secondary list so we do not blow up the main thread. And as he slid a printout across the table in a quiet back office with the hum of a soda machine for company, I saw my sister's email alias nestled beside the changed reminder. The time nudged by just enough minutes to guarantee that anyone who trusted her would miss the first hour and then the second, and sitting there with the fluorescent light buzzing, I felt the brittle satisfaction of a suspicion becoming a fact, along with the more complicated ache of realizing that the emptiness I had tried to file under neglect belonged in a drawer labeled design. I walked home slowly, letting the blocks untangle, past the bakery with its trays of impossible gloss and the pharmacy where I have bought every version of resilience in a bottle, and I thought about how humiliations become rituals when you do not interrupt them. How families develop muscle memory for the shape of your patience, and by the time I reached my door I knew that whatever I did next had to be the opposite of a speech, that it had to be architecture, something you build once and then live inside without needing to defend it every second day. So I opened my laptop and drafted 2 documents that said the same thing in different dialects, one for lawyers and one for human beings. The legal demand for a full audit of any funds moved without my consent, and the invitation to a very small, very local ceremony at the same venue. Nothing grand, just a quiet night to thank the employees who would be moving through the transition with me. A night for the people who had already shown up when there were no cameras. I sent the invitation to my family exactly as I had before, with the address and the hour spelled out in words even a distracted mind could not mangle, and I reserved 4 seats again because I am stubborn and because rituals do not end themselves. And on the evening of the event I arrived early in a dress that looked like I had chosen peace and meant it, and I asked the operations manager for one small favor that felt petty in the request and clean in the execution, that the main doors would be used by employees and partners and students and librarians, and that anyone who arrived with an old screenshot or an altered reminder would be directed, politely and without drama, to the side entrance where a monitor would loop the clip of my original night, the one where I said that if you did not care enough to be there you should not bother calling after. Because sometimes a mirror is the gentlest instrument you can reach for when you are done breaking yourself against explanations. They came in a sequence that would have been funny if I had not been the punchline for so long. Lena first, cheeks lifted into a smile that asked for absolution before she had earned comprehension, holding out a gift bag that clinked, then Dad, hand on her shoulder as if to remind me that authority still conferred gravity, then Mom in a pastel jacket that looked like apology had a color, and Tom at the very end with that practiced grin that has closed so many negotiations and so few distances. And they followed the signs without protest because politeness is a currency we all understand, and when I stepped onto the little stage in the main hall, the room warm with the low murmur of gratitude, The air full of those comfortable clinks that mean people have exhaled. I looked at the front row where the 4 seats sat unoccupied again, and I realized with a clarity that did not sting that their emptiness had finally stopped being about me. I talked about unglamorous things in a voice that felt like the opposite of a performance, about payroll continuity and cross-training stipends, and the first scholarship checks for the 2 teenagers who worked weekends at the library and never asked for credit. And I named the grants after 4 concepts that used to be excuses in my house and were now policies in my company: presence, care, notice, and follow through. And when the little plaques were carried to the edge of the stage, the room rose in a quiet, stubborn applause that did not crest, but held, a kind of standing heartbeat that said we understand without having to say the words out loud. Afterward, when the crowd thinned and the catering crew folded tables with that satisfying snap of clean labor, I stepped outside into the alley where the air was cooler and less polite, and my family waited by the side entrance with expressions I recognized even in the half-light: Mom's wet confusion, Dad's managerial bafflement, Lena's brightness turned brittle at the edges, Tom's calculation searching for purchase. And I held up the venue printout without brandishing it, the way you show identification, and said that I knew about the time changes and the rerouted reminders and the small, deliberate cruelty of executing a plan and then performing hurt when it worked too well. And Lena opened her mouth and then closed it. And in the long pause that followed, I felt the strange generosity of finally not needing an apology to validate my memory. I told them there would be no public naming and no online spectacle, that I was not in the business of turning my family into content, and that the audit would proceed because daylight is not cruelty. And I said that if they wanted something from me, it would have to begin with showing up without controlling the rules of entry, and I watched the understanding land unevenly, because fairness rarely arrives as a comfort. And after a moment, Mom asked if we could have dinner soon, somewhere quiet, where we could talk like people who love each other, and I said that I would consider it, which was the most honest sentence available to me, and I meant it, although I did not say when or how or under what configuration of doors. At home, near midnight, I set my phone on the counter beside the signed contracts and the leftover place cards, and the screen pulsed with new messages layered over old ones, a palimpsest of concern and defense and silence. And I composed a final note that was not a finale so much as a boundary with soft edges, that I wished them rest and clarity, and that in the morning I would be unreachable until afternoon because I had promised myself a few hours of quiet. And I hit send and turned the device face down, and as the apartment settled into that comfortable hush that arrives after you have moved the furniture, and the echoes discover the new shape, I looked at the old family photo on the bookshelf and did not take it down. Because I am not interested in erasing the evidence of who we were, only in declining to live inside it. And when the phone buzzed once more with a voicemail from Dad that began with my name and a pause as long as our history, I let it play to the end without pressing delete, and I stood there listening to his careful words and the empty space between them, and I thought, not unkindly, that sometimes the truest revenge is a life ordered so precisely that forgiveness has the time it needs to either arrive or stay away. And for the first time since the night of the 4 empty chairs, I did not wonder which it would be.